In light of England's recent graceful and peaceful transfer of power on our Independence Day, while the people running to lead our country are arguing about who is better at golf, somebody said maybe we would have been better off if the UK had won the Revolutionary War. And my initial reaction was, hell no, man. You might have a point. Because if you think about it objectively, it's pretty hard to argue with the logic. Now, right off the bat, by 1783, England had stopped colonizing and we were just getting started. To be fair, a lot of that had to do with us kicking their tea and crumpets back to their little island, so there's no saying if they would have continued colonization had they won the Revolutionary War. And there is a very solid argument to be made that had they maintained control of the colonies, they would have pushed for the same territorial expanses that we did. But there's no conceivable way it would have been any worse than our colonial practices, and I honestly feel like it would have been better because in part there probably would have been less British meddling in Central and South America than what we did. And British policies about, other people started becoming far more humane far earlier than ours did. Which brings me to my next example and arguably the key difference in the trajectory of our country had we lost the Revolutionary War: slavery. Europe started banning the slave trade in 1807 and England banned slavery in all of its colonies in 1834. 3 decades before us. Now let's just ignore the human rights reasons it would have been better to, end slavery 30 years earlier had we lost the revolution. Let's just talk about the comparative national implications of how the Civil War and slavery shaped our country and how it still affects us today versus what would have happened if England had been in charge. See, slavery, more than any other one thing, is the foundation of our governmental system and our entire country. We built it that way to appease some racist southern fucks to talk them into joining us in fighting the British, where slavery was becoming wildly unpopular and the writing was on the wall that they weren't going to be able to own people much longer. And to do that, our entire government was set up to give slave states more power. There's obvious things like the 3/5 Compromise to give slave states more representation in Congress. But then you know how every state gets 2 senators? Yeah, that was done so lower population slave states had equal power to free states in the Senate. The Electoral College in part existed to give lower population slave states outweighted voting power in the presidential elections. Police forces were originally formed as slave catchers, and I guess some things haven't changed. Or hey, remember the Alamo? That time Texas can't stop bragging about how a bunch of Tennesseans came down to fight their battles for them and they got their asses kicked? What is it with Southerners always bragging about losing shit? But yeah, the Alamo and Texas, the whole reason that was fought, the Mexican-American War, and the reason we have Texas is because of slavery. See, it was Mexico, and American settlers were living there at the time, and some of them were slaveholders. And Mexico was cool with letting the American settlers live there because they're not, assholes who thought they should have built a wall, although apparently they should have. And then in the mid-1830s, they're like, hey, you guys are welcome to stay, but the slaves gotta go. We're not gonna do the slavery thing anymore. And a bunch of racist fucking Southerners were like, you're gonna tell me that I can't own humans over my dead body. And Santa Anna was like, okay. But then the federal government stepped in and they're like, nobody's gonna tell us we can't own people. And then we just took a bunch of Mexico and mine now because slavery. Then when Kansas was democratically admitted to the Union as a free state, it gave free states outweighted voting power in Washington over slave states. So a bunch of racist Southerners who would once again rather die than give up their ability to own people saw the writing on the wall that their slaveholding days were limited. Then they got together and they formed a big terror group called the Confederate States of America, and they're like, the only obvious solution to this impending problem is treason, and they started committing mass terror attacks against their own country. Then you know the story. A man from Ohio taught Southerners how to barbecue and we freed the slaves. But then we coddled the little bitch-ass losers because they were crying about how we were so mean, and we allowed them to rewrite their history like it was some noble cause. We let them legally mandate segregation and build institutionalized racism into our judicial system. And the Civil War never really ended. It just went cold. We spent the next century still fighting for equal rights for African Americans. And our two-party system and 100% of the political division we have in our country today is a direct result of slavery and the way we abolished it. In fact, to this day, every single one of our opposing political ideologies boils down to whether or not all people deserve to be treated as human or not. Every single one of them. But if England had been in charge and abolished slavery in 1834 and the Southerners had gotten all uppity, well, you know how England treated traitors. There would have been no Daughters of the Confederacy, there would have been no participation trophies in public squares, nobody would have been allowed to fly their treason rag, and Strange Fruit would have been a drinking song about a British victory. It would have been a very different timeline. Yeah, but then we wouldn't be America. Yeah, we would be, because by the 1850s, England started allowing its colonies to self-govern. So we would have had all of the benefits of being a part of the UK, like dual citizenship and free healthcare and cheap college, but still got to pick our own leadership and run our own country. And then the First and Second World Wars likely would have went very differently because US involvement would have started right away. I mean, if B-17 started bombing the Blitzkrieg in 1939 rather than 1941 and the combined might of the US and British Navy was out there hunting subs, the Second World War may have had a much swifter ending. A good number of our global geopolitical problems that we experience today today could be very different, including the big one in the Middle East, you know, something about Benjamin, if you catch my drift. And the way that the Second World War led to the Cold War, which also led to a ton of our problems in the Middle East. All I'm getting at is that it's hard to argue that we're objectively better off not being a part of the UK. And believe me, that is a really hard thing to say.